The house on Hollow Creek Lane didn't feel lived in, it felt watched. From the moment I stepped inside, I could feel it, a sense of waiting like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The realtor's pitch about its vintage charm faded from memory as I noticed the way shadows pooled unnaturally in corners and how the house seemed too quiet, as though the outside world stopped at its walls. It wasn't a house I would have chosen if I'd had more time or money, but desperation has a way of dulling instincts. Within a day of signing the papers, I moved in with little more than a suitcase and a plan to make it work. I told myself the creaks and groans were normal for a house of this age. The drafts, too. The stories locals told me in hesitant tones, a tragedy here, an unexplained disappearance there, were just small-town folklore. Or so I wanted to believe. A week later, while clearing out the basement, I found the door. It wasn't where you'd expect a door to be, not at the back or even in the center of the room. It was off to one side, tucked into the uneven stone wall as though the house had grown around it. The wood looked ancient, almost petrified, and deep gouges scored its surface. Instead of a doorknob, it had an iron ring that felt unnaturally cold when I touched it. I hesitated before opening it. The room grew so quiet I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. When I pulled the door open, I expected to see a small storage space or even another empty room. Instead, the doorway yawned into blackness. A narrow spiral staircase descended into the earth, its edges crumbling with age. The air that rose to greet me was icy and damp, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell that made me instinctively take a step back. I reached for the flashlight in my back pocket, but a noise stopped me cold, a soft, uneven scrape like someone dragging their fingers across stone. I slammed the door shut and shoved a heavy shelf in front of it. That night, I tried to convince myself the door didn't matter, that whatever lay beyond it wasn't my problem. But as I lay in bed, I began to hear it. Faint whispers, so soft they could have been mistaken for the wind, except there was no breeze that night. The whispers started low, growing steadily louder, until I realized they were coming from beneath me. I bolted upright, heart pounding. For several seconds, the whispers stopped, leaving the room so silent it felt suffocating. And then came the knock, 3 slow, deliberate strikes. Not on the front door, or even the walls of my room, but from somewhere deep below, beneath the floorboards. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I summoned the courage to go back to the basement. The door was open. The shelf I'd shoved in front of it had been pushed aside, the gouges on the wood now deeper, as though something had dragged its nails across it from the other side. The door was open wider now, enough to reveal the top of the staircase that spiraled into blackness. My breath hitched as I approached it, every nerve screaming at me to turn around and leave. Yet I couldn't, not without knowing. I stood there, gripping the edge of the door, peering down into the darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling and weak. The reply was immediate, a soft, whispering hiss that seemed to echo up from the depths. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like the suggestion of sound, as if meaning itself was trying to claw its way into my mind. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut again with a trembling hand. My heart thundered as I shoved the shelf back in front of it, pushing it so hard it scraped the floor. For a moment, silence returned, but it was the wrong kind of silence. It pressed against my ears, heavier than before, like the house was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Stress, I thought. Too much caffeine. Not enough sleep. That's what this was. What else could it be? By mid-afternoon, the whispers had faded from my memory, pushed aside by the routine of unpacking and cleaning. I even dared to think the incident was behind me, until I saw the scratches. The walls of the basement were marked now, long, uneven gouges that hadn't been there before. My fingers hesitated as they brushed over the jagged edges, but I flinched as something sharp sliced into my skin. A bead of blood welled up, bright red against my trembling hand, and I yanked it back, my heart pounding with fear. I bolted up the basement stairs, slamming the door behind me with trembling hands. I didn't dare go back down, not even for my tools. Fear had rooted me firmly on the other side of that door, and that's where I intended to stay. That night, the knocking came again. This time it wasn't just 3 knocks. It was a deliberate pattern. It started slowly. 1 knock, then another, followed by a pause, before escalating into a frenzied rhythm that shook the floorboards beneath me. It was the sound of a fist hammering relentlessly against the wood. I yanked the blanket over my head, clutching it tightly like it could somehow shield me. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The knocking didn't care. It kept going, relentless and thunderous, echoing through every corner of the house. It felt like it lasted for hours, each pounding blow tightening the grip of fear in my chest. When it finally ceased, I lay there in silence, heart pounding, sweat soaking my sheets. Then, just as I started to believe it was over, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, closer. "Come see," they said. The words weren't in any language I recognized, yet their meaning was clear. They were calling out to me, luring me. Somewhere deep below, behind that old door, something was waiting. The next morning, I was a wreck. My hands trembled violently as I gripped my coffee mug, the warmth doing nothing to steady my nerves or clear the fog in my head. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper of wind outside felt deafening, setting me on edge. But it was the silence that truly terrified me. The heavy, suffocating quiet between those noises, like the house itself was waiting for something, watching. I decided I couldn't stay there another night. I needed a hotel, a friend's couch, anywhere but Hollow Creek Lane. I had just begun packing my essentials when I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze mid-step, my heart hammering. It was coming from the basement. "No," I whispered to myself. "Not again." The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic creak. Against all better judgment, I crept to the basement door. My breath hitched as I pressed my ear against it. Silence. I pulled away, half relieved, half terrified. Then the door shuddered violently, as if something had slammed against it from the other side. I stumbled back, biting down a scream. The air around me felt colder, and with each passing second, a low, guttural sound began to rise from the other side of the door. It was somewhere between a groan and a growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. And then came the voice. "Don't leave!" It wasn't a shout or a plea. It was a command, spoken with the weight of something ancient and cruel. I bolted up the stairs, throwing myself into the daylight spilling through the kitchen windows. My phone was in my hand before I even realized it, dialing the first number I could think of. "Detective Lawton," the voice on the other end said, brisk but distracted. "Detective, it's Aaron Mullins," I stammered, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. You came by during the house inspection." My voice quivered, barely above a whisper, but I forced myself to keep going. "There's something in the basement. Something alive. Please, you have to help me." There was a long, heavy pause before the voice on the other end finally spoke. "Mr. Mullins, are you saying someone's broken into the house?" The question hung in the air, but all I could think about was what was lurking below. I opened my mouth to say yes, to give him any reason to come out here, but the words caught in my throat. How could I even explain it? That the house felt alive? That something deep in the basement had whispered to me? My hands shook as the silence stretched on, my fear choking the truth. Instead, I stammered, "There's a door in the basement." It wasn't on the inspection report. I think someone's been living down there. That seemed to catch his attention. "I'll send someone by," he said. "Stay upstairs, and don't engage with anyone you see. Do you understand?" "Yes," I whispered, hanging up. I sat in the living room, my hands clenched and every nerve on edge, straining to hear the knock on the door that would mean help had come. But the house stayed silent. The sound I was desperate for never came. Instead, the whispers started again. This time, they weren't coming from below. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the air around me, faint and overlapping, like dozens of voices all speaking at once. And then I heard the sound of the basement door opening. I hadn't moved from the couch when I heard the creak of the basement door. My body froze, paralyzed by the unmistakable sound of old hinges groaning open. It was deliberate, not the random shift of wood expanding or settling. Someone or something had opened that door. The whispers grew louder, coiling around me like invisible threads. "Come see," they urged, their words tangling with each other in a maddening chorus. My breathing quickened, and I clutched a throw pillow as if it could shield me. Footsteps, heavy, uneven. They moved up the basement stairs one at a time, each one accompanied by a low, dragging scrape. "No, no, no," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. "This isn't real. It's stress. I'm imagining it." But the footsteps didn't stop. When they reached the top of the stairs, the house fell silent. The kind of silence that hums in your ears and makes the blood in your veins feel too loud. I opened my eyes and stared at the archway leading to the basement. The door hung slightly ajar, and beyond it, the shadow of something shifted, just enough to confirm I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice trembling. The answer wasn't words. It was a soft, wet sound like flesh sliding across stone. And then something moved into the light. At first, my mind refused to make sense of what I was seeing. It was hunched, vaguely humanoid, but something about it was so horribly wrong it made my skin crawl. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints twisted and bent in ways that defied nature. Its head tilted in an unnerving, jerky motion, and there was barely a face, just hollow, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. It stood in the archway for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Then it stepped forward, dragging itself closer, the scraping sound following it like a shadow. That broke me. I scrambled off the couch, knocking over the coffee table as I ran for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, shaking so violently that I almost didn't get it open in time. I burst into the yard, slamming the door shut behind me with shaking hands. The cold night air bit at my skin, but it felt safer than the oppressive darkness inside. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the yard, and the house loomed behind me, its silhouette even more menacing in the pale glow. I ran to my car, but my keys were still inside. Frantic, I sprinted down the driveway and into the street, not stopping until I reached the neighbor's house. Mrs. Hargrove answered on the second knock, her eyes widening as she took in my pale face and trembling hands. "What happened?" she asked. "There's someone in my house," I gasped. Her expression shifted from concern to something harder to read. "Inside Hollow Creek?" "Yes," I said. "Please call the police." But instead of reaching for her phone, she hesitated. Her eyes darted past me, toward my house, and she took a step back. "You should leave," she said, her voice low. "What?" "Leave," she repeated. "You should have never gone inside that house. You're not safe there." Mrs. Hargrove shut the door before I could say another word. I pounded on it, shouting, "Please call the police. Someone's in my house." But there was no response. The curtains in her front window twitched, and I realized she was watching me from behind them, her face pale and full of something I couldn't decipher. Fear, guilt, or maybe just resignation. I backed away from her porch, feeling utterly alone. My house loomed in the distance, its dark windows like eyes staring me down. The whispers were gone now, and the silence in the air was somehow worse. I needed my phone, my car keys. I needed anything to get me out of this nightmare. With my heart pounding, I crept back toward the house, each step slower than the last. The door stood firmly shut, and for a fleeting moment, I clung to the hope that I'd imagined it. The thing in the basement. Maybe it was just the stress messing with my mind. Maybe I was overtired, hallucinating. But deep down, I knew better. I opened the door. The house was eerily still. Nothing moved, not a flicker, not a shadow. But the air was suffocatingly wrong, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like I'd walked into a room filled with invisible smoke. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, every instinct screaming at me to leave. My keys were on the kitchen counter, and I forced myself to creep toward them, every step deliberate and measured. I grabbed them, the familiar jingle breaking the eerie silence, and let out a shaky breath. That's when I noticed the basement door. It was open again. I spun toward the front door, my body ready to flee. But just as I was about to move, the house let out a low, guttural groan, a sound so deep it felt like it came from its very bones. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. And then, the voice came again. "You can't leave." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words reverberated inside me, making my skin crawl. I glanced back at the basement door, my breath catching in my throat. Something was coming up the stairs. Slowly, methodically, the sound of dragging. I sprinted for the door, my hand shaking so violently that the lock seemed impossible to work. Every second stretched into eternity as I fumbled with the knob, my breath ragged and shallow. Finally, with a desperate twist, the door gave way, and I shoved it open. Instinct made me glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. It was there, standing at the top of the stairs, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its hollow, empty sockets fixed on me, boring into my very soul. Then it smiled, but the smile wasn't human. It was too wide, the edges curling up unnaturally, almost to where its ears should have been. The jagged, yellow teeth seemed to glisten in the dim light, sharp and wrong. It didn't move, but I could feel its intent, suffocating and overwhelming, like invisible hands reaching for me. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, slamming the door shut and locking it in a single frantic motion. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition, adrenaline blurring my vision. My foot pressed hard on the gas pedal as I twisted the key again and again. The engine sputtered, coughed, and refused to start. "Please, please," I shouted, twisting the key one more time. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, the house loomed, its dark silhouette barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows. But as I sped down the empty road, headlights cutting through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. And then I heard it knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the engine's roar, but it was there. My breath hitched as I pressed harder on the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached an old diner a few miles down the road, parking in the deserted lot behind it. I killed the engine and leaned back in the seat, trying to catch my breath, but the knock echoed in my mind like a phantom heartbeat. The car felt suffocating, the air heavy and stale. I stepped out into the cold night, my breath visible in the flickering light of a broken street lamp. What did I see? What did I let out? My phone was still in my pocket, somehow forgotten in my frantic escape. My fingers fumbled as I pulled it out, staring at the screen. Logic told me to call someone, anyone who could help. But deep in my chest, something darker whispered the truth. No one could help. I dialed anyway. Detective Lawton answered on the third ring. "Lawton here," he said, his tone clipped. "This is Aaron Mullins," I stammered, my voice barely steady. "Something's wrong with my house." "Mr. Mullins," he sighed, sounding weary. "We've already promised to send someone to check." "No," I interrupted, my voice rising in panic. "You don't understand. There's something alive in the house." The silence on the line was heavy, tense. "Mr. Mullins, are you in immediate danger?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," I whispered, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "It's not a person. It's something else." My gaze darted to the edge of the lot, where a shadow pooled unnaturally under the broken street lamp. It was shifting, writhing, as though alive. My voice cracked. "It's following me, watching me. Please, you have to help me before it." I froze mid-sentence as my breath caught painfully in my throat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shape emerging from the shadows, its hollow gaze fixed on me, unblinking. It was closer now. The first knock was faint, barely more than a tap against the car's roof. Standing outside in the cold night air, I told myself it was nothing, just a branch swaying in the wind or some stray piece of debris. But my stomach churned with unease. Then came the second knock, louder, sharper. It reverberated through the car's metal frame, cutting through the stillness of the empty lot. My breath hitched as I glanced around, the dim light from the street lamp casting long, flickering shadows. The lot was empty, or at least it looked that way. When the third knock came, the entire car trembled. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, my eyes darting between the darkness and the car. I didn't wait to see what it was. Panic surged, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door shut, I locked it in one frantic motion. My hands gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline, trembling uncontrollably. I forced myself to breathe, short and shallow gasps that felt like they weren't enough. My eyes locked on the windshield, refusing to look up. Then came another knock. This one was louder, closer, right above me. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to stay still, I tilted my head back. The roof groaned under its weight, the metal creaking as though something impossibly heavy had settled on top. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but it was useless. All I could see was the faint reflection of my pale, horrified face. "Leave me alone," I whispered, though I knew it wouldn't listen. The knocking stopped. For one agonizing moment, there was silence. My pulse hammered in my ears, each beat a countdown to something I couldn't prepare for. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A single, gnarled hand slid down the driver's side window, its claw-like fingers scraping the glass. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. I bit down on a scream, the sound clawing its way up my throat. The hand disappeared, leaving behind a smear of something dark and oily. And then I heard it. A knock. Not on the car. From the trunk. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate, vibrating through the car. I froze, every nerve screaming for me to get back in the car and drive until the gas ran out. But something rooted me in place. A sick, horrible curiosity. My legs felt like lead as I crept toward the back of the car, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The trunk loomed ahead, and with every step, the weight in my chest grew heavier. The third knock echoed through the silence, louder this time. Whatever was inside wasn't just waiting, it wanted out. I reached the trunk, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the release. "It's not real," I whispered to myself, over and over, as if saying it aloud would make it true. The latch clicked. The hood trunk swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. For a moment, I thought it was empty. Relief began to flood through me, but then something shifted. A shape, visible in the shadows, uncurled itself from the corner of the trunk. It wasn't the creature from the basement. It wasn't even human. Its form was wrong. Half human, half animal with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. It stared at me, unblinking, and then it smiled. "You can't leave," it whispered, the voice both soft and razor-sharp. My body moved before my mind caught up. I slammed the trunk shut and stumbled back, falling onto the asphalt. The thing inside didn't pound on the lid, didn't scream or roar, just laughed. A low, guttural sound that didn't belong in this world. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself back into the car, locking the doors as if I could somehow keep it contained. The laughter stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the car began to shake. It was subtle at first, like the wind had picked up, but it grew stronger, more violent, until the entire vehicle was rocking side to side. My screams were drowned out by the deafening roar of something impossibly large surrounding me. And then it stopped. The car was still again, the world eerily quiet. I looked around, every nerve on edge, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the night. I reached for the ignition, desperate to leave, but when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. And then, faintly I heard it. The whispers were back, not outside, but inside the car. They were close, surrounding me, suffocating me. "You brought us here," they said. My vision blurred, the world spinning as the words sank into my mind. I clutched the steering wheel, gasping for air, but the whispers only grew louder. And then I realized I wasn't sitting alone anymore. The air inside the car was thick, almost liquid, making making it hard to breathe. The whispers churned around me, rising and falling like a tide. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see who, or what, was now sitting beside me. But I couldn't help it. My head turned slowly, as if something else was guiding it, forcing me to face what I already knew was there. The passenger seat wasn't empty anymore. It sat hunched forward, its elongated limbs barely fitting within the cramped space. Its face was a shifting blur, details coming into focus only to melt away, like smoke trying to form a shape. But the eyes, they were the only constant. Two endless voids that stared straight into me, filling my mind with static. "You never should have opened it," it said, the voice layered with tones that didn't belong together. Childlike and ancient, soft and guttural. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, choking on my words. Its head tilted, that impossible grin spreading wider. "But you did. And now?" The car jolted violently, throwing me forward. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, as the headlights flickered wildly. Through the windshield, the road began to twist, the asphalt bubbling and cracking as something massive shifted beneath it. The creature reached out, its hand stretching impossibly far until it rested lightly on mine. Its touch was freezing, burning, and wrong all at once. "Take us home," it said. I shook my head violently, yanking my hand away. "No!" I screamed. The road disappeared. One moment it was there, stretching into the night, and the next, it was gone, replaced by an endless void. The car floated in nothingness, surrounded by swirling shadows that pulsed with malevolent intent. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a single, commanding roar. "Take us back!" The creature lunged, its limbs bending and snapping as it closed the distance between us. I didn't think. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, even though there was no road to drive on, and the car roared forward into the abyss. The shadows swallowed me whole, and for a moment there was nothing to no sound, no light, no air, just the overwhelming sense that I was falling deeper and deeper into the dark. Then, with a bone-rattling thud, I slammed into the bottom of the ditch, the impact jarring every inch of my body. I opened my eyes, gasping, and found myself back where it all began, the house on Hollow Creek Lane. The front door stood open, the light from within spilling out onto the driveway. And there, in the doorway, stood the thing from the basement. It raised one long, clawed hand and gestured for me to come inside. Behind me, the car locks clicked open on their own. The whispers softened, their tone almost gentle now. "It's time to come home," they said.